There is a specific moment in your life that appears exactly once. It feels like everything is breaking apart. You might think you are losing your mind. But Carl Jung discovered this is not a breakdown. This is the single most important psychological checkpoint in your entire existence. He called it the Nekyia, the night sea journey, the death of your old self. And if you are feeling it right now, the confusion, the emptiness, the terror that nothing makes sense anymore, you are not ending, you are beginning. Most people panic when they see this sign. They run back to the familiar. They trap themselves in the old self forever, living as ghosts of who they could have become. But today, we will reveal exactly what this sign looks like, what it means, and why walking through this fire, instead of running from it, is the only way your true self can be born. Because Jung discovered something terrifying. Your old self must die completely before the new one can breathe. The first symptom arrives quietly. Things that used to bring you joy, your hobbies, your relationships, your career achievements, suddenly feel ash-gray and meaningless. This is not sadness. Sadness has weight and texture. This is the void. Jung called it the erosion of the persona, the social mask you have worn your entire life without realizing it was not your face. Consider a case profile that illustrates this pattern perfectly. A patient presented with what seemed like textbook depression. Successful career, respected position, loving family, admired by colleagues. But the description was haunting. Feeling like a ghost walking through his own life. Sitting in meetings that once energized him and feeling absolutely nothing. Coming home to his children and having to fake enthusiasm. Looking in the mirror and not recognizing the person staring back. Not because his appearance changed, but because the story he told himself about who he was had stopped working. Jung's clinical observations revealed this was not depression, though it wore depression's clothing. This was the persona cracking open like an eggshell. The identity you built to survive in the world was revealing itself as a construction, not a truth. And that revelation feels like death, because in a very real sense, it is death. The you that you thought you were is dissolving. This feeling of emptiness is terrifying, but that terror is actually a signal. Modern society treats this phase as a problem to be fixed. They call it depression, a midlife crisis, burnout. They offer medication, therapy focused on returning you to normal, advice about self-care and work-life balance. Jung disagreed violently with this approach. He argued that treating this as a problem to be fixed is dangerous because it stops the necessary process of disintegration. You cannot rebuild a house while pretending the foundation is solid. You cannot become who you actually are while clinging to who you pretended to be. Jung's clinical work showed that people who medicated away this discomfort, who forced themselves back into their old patterns, who refused the call of transformation, often ended up in far worse psychological states years later. The psyche will not be denied. If you refuse the voluntary death of the old self, the psyche will eventually force an involuntary one, usually through crisis, illness, or complete breakdown. This is not theory. This is what Jung observed repeatedly across decades of practice. The dissolution follows a pattern Jung mapped across hundreds of cases. Stage 1 is the withdrawal of projections. You stop caring what others think, not in the healthy boundary-setting way, but in a destabilizing, frightening way. The social mask that protected you from judgment simply falls off, leaving you feeling naked and vulnerable. You realize you have spent decades performing for an audience that was never really watching. You have sacrificed your authentic desires for approval that was always conditional and ultimately meaningless. This revelation should feel liberating. Instead, it feels like standing in the middle of a crowded room, completely exposed. You suddenly see how much of your personality was constructed to please parents, impress peers, meet expectations that were never actually yours. And without those external reference points, you do not know who you are. The ground beneath your feet disappears. Every conversation feels like performance art, where you forgot your lines. Every social interaction requires energy you no longer have because you are no longer sure which version of yourself you are supposed to be presenting. Stage 2 arrives like an ambush. As the old self cracks open, suppressed emotions and memories flood in. Jung called this the return of the shadow. All the parts of yourself you denied, rejected, buried in the unconscious because they did not fit the story you needed to tell about who you were. The anger you were never allowed to express. The desires you were taught to be ashamed of. The grief you never had permission to feel. The ambitions you sacrificed for others. The selfishness you pretended did not exist. The cruelty you convinced yourself you were incapable of. All of it comes rushing back with devastating force. You might find yourself crying without knowing why, feeling rage at people who do not deserve it, wanting things that contradict everything you thought you valued. Having dreams so vivid and disturbing, you are afraid to go to sleep. Memories surfacing from childhood that you thought you had processed, but clearly never did. This is not you losing control. This is you meeting yourself, the real self, for the first time. And the real self is always more complex, more contradictory, more wild than the persona ever allowed. Empaths aren't broken. They're alchemists in progress. The alchemist's path gives you drills, Jung-based boundaries, and 3 exclusive chapter videos to turn overwhelm into clarity. By Surreal Mind, 236-page downloadable ebook in stock. Begin now at thesurrealmind.com. But stage 2, as intense as it feels, is not the scariest phase. Stage 3 is the scariest phase. Jung called it the loss of meaning, the liminal space. You are between worlds. The old you is dead. The new you has not been born. You exist in a psychological void where nothing has meaning yet. You cannot go back to who you were because you have seen through that identity. But you cannot move forward because you do not know who you are becoming. Time feels strange. Days blur together. You go through motions but feel disconnected from everything you do. People ask if you are okay, and you do not know how to answer because you are not sure what okay means anymore. You are not depressed, though others might call it that. You are not anxious, though uncertainty fills every moment. You are in between. You are in the darkness between death and rebirth. You are in what mystics called the dark night of the soul, what Jung called the nigredo, the blackening, the phase of total dissolution before reconstitution becomes possible. Jung observed that this phase, more than any other, is where people break. They cannot tolerate the uncertainty. They cannot sit in the void. They cannot exist without a story about who they are. So they rush back to the old self, or they rush into a new identity that is just another mask. They get married, divorced, change careers, move across the country, adopt radical new belief systems, anything to escape the emptiness. But the emptiness is not the problem. The emptiness is the womb. You cannot be reborn without first existing in the space where nothing is formed yet. This is the paradox that breaks people. The very thing that feels like death is actually the condition for rebirth. But you cannot know that while you are in it. You can only trust the process or collapse under the weight of not knowing. Then stage 4 arrives. This is the core of everything. The sign Jung identified appears when synchronicity combines with disillusionment. The external world starts mirroring your internal chaos. You notice patterns everywhere, numbers repeating, conversations that seem impossibly relevant to your exact situation. People appearing in your life who reflect exactly what you are struggling with. Books falling off shelves at the exact moment you need their message. Songs on the radio speaking directly to your situation. Dreams that predict minor events the next day. Jung called this synchronicity, meaningful coincidences that have no causal connection but carry profound psychological significance. But here is what makes this the sign of the old self, dying. The synchronicities are not comforting, they are disturbing. They do not guide you toward easy answers. They show you how deeply asleep you have been. They reveal how much of your life was unconscious repetition. They mirror back your own self-deception with brutal clarity. At the same time, you experience profound disillusionment. Not disappointment, but the literal dissolution of illusions. You see through everything. The career you thought mattered reveals itself as a game you never agreed to play. The relationship you thought was solid shows its cracks and compromises. The beliefs you thought were yours turn out to be inherited scripts you never questioned. The values you defended turn out to be conditioning you never examined. The goals you pursued turn out to be someone else's definition of success. Everything you built your life on suddenly looks like a house of cards, and you cannot unsee the fragility. The combination of synchronicity and disillusionment creates a psychological state Jung found both dangerous and necessary. Dangerous because you feel unmoored from consensus reality. You cannot participate in normal conversations because you see through the social agreements that make them possible. You cannot engage in small talk because everything feels either deeply meaningful or completely pointless. You cannot maintain relationships that require you to pretend you do not see what you now see. Necessary because only by seeing through the constructed nature of your old reality can you participate consciously in creating a new one. But why does this happen? Why must the old self die completely before the new one can breathe? Jung discovered the answer in his own descent into what he called the confrontation with the unconscious. Between 1913 and 1919, following his break with Freud, Jung experienced what might have been diagnosed as a psychotic break. He had visions, heard voices, felt possessed by forces beyond his understanding. He documented everything in what would become the Red Book. What he learned during those years revolutionized his understanding of human psychology. The ego, the conscious sense of I, is necessary for navigating the world. But the ego is not the totality of who you are. It is a small island of consciousness floating in the vast ocean of the unconscious. The persona is the mask the ego wears to interact with society. For most of your life, the persona works. It gets you through school, helps you make friends, builds your career, earns respect and approval. But the persona is always a compromise. It emphasizes certain aspects of your personality while suppressing others. It presents the version of you that fits societal expectations while hiding the parts that do not fit. This works until it does not, usually around the middle of life, though it can happen earlier or later. The unconscious begins to rebel. The suppressed aspects of your personality, the unlived life, the rejected possibilities, all start demanding recognition. This is not a malfunction. This is the psyche trying to complete itself, to integrate what was left behind, to become whole instead of just acceptable. The old self must die because it was never whole. It was functional, adapted, successful even, but it was incomplete. The new self that wants to be born is not a better version of the old self. It is a fundamentally different organization of your psyche, one that includes the shadow instead of projecting it, one that serves your authentic nature instead of external expectations, one that is grounded in reality instead of illusion. But here is the terrifying truth Jung discovered. The ego fights to survive. It screams to go back to normal, because to the ego, this process feels like literal death. And in a sense, it is. The identity structure you have lived inside your entire life is being dismantled. Every certainty you relied on is being questioned. Every story you told yourself about who you are is being rewritten. The ego experiences this as annihilation, And so it fights with every weapon it has. It generates fear. It creates doubt. It whispers that you are making a mistake, that you should go back to how things were, that this transformation is dangerous and foolish and doomed to fail. It convinces you that the emptiness means something is wrong rather than something is finally going right. It tells you that everyone else has it figured out, and you are the only one falling apart. It makes you believe that if you just try harder, think smarter, get better advice, you can fix yourself back into the old shape, but you cannot, and every attempt to do so only increases the suffering. This is the moment of maximum tension, the climax of the entire process. Jung called it the point of surrender. You cannot fight the death of the old self. You cannot force your way through this. You cannot think your way out. The only way through is active surrender. Not passive giving up, but conscious acceptance of the process. You must grieve the old self like a lost friend. You must acknowledge that the person you were served a purpose, got you this far, was necessary and valuable, and also is no longer adequate for who you are becoming. This is the paradox at the heart of transformation. You must let go of something that worked, something that kept you safe, something familiar and known for something uncertain and unknown. You must step into the void with no guarantee of what waits on the other side. Jung observed that people who successfully navigated this surrender shared a common quality. They developed what he called the capacity to hold the tension of opposites. They could simultaneously honor the old self and release it. They could feel the fear and move forward anyway. They could live in the uncertainty without collapsing into it. They became comfortable with not knowing, with being in process, with existing in the liminal space between death and rebirth. They stopped demanding that the process move faster, or make sense, or provide certainty. They learned to trust that the psyche knows what it is doing even when the ego has no idea. And then something shifts. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but gradually. The new energy returns. But it is different, calmer, deeper, grounded in reality rather than projection. You start to feel solid again, but the solidity is different. Before you felt solid because you did not question your identity. Now you feel solid because you have questioned everything and rebuilt on a foundation of self-knowledge instead of self-deception. The things that used to matter stop mattering, not because you become cynical, but because you stop seeking meaning in external validation. The things that never mattered before start becoming important. Authenticity, depth, truth, creative expression, service that comes from genuine care instead of obligation. Your relationships change. Some fall away because they were built on the old self, on mutual performance and projection. Others deepen because the people in them can meet your authenticity with their own. You discover you no longer need as many people in your life, but the people who remain matter infinitely more. Your work changes. Even if you stay in the same career, your relationship to it transforms. You stop performing competence and start offering genuine contribution. You stop seeking advancement for its own sake and start asking what actually needs doing. You might leave your career entirely, not impulsively, but with clarity about what serves your actual nature versus what served your persona. The sign was not a warning of doom. The sign was a notification of upgrade. The death of the old self was not punishment. It was invitation. Jung called the result of this process individuation, becoming who you actually are instead of who you were conditioned to be. The individuated self is not perfect. It is not enlightened in some transcendent sense. It is simply whole. It contains both light and shadow, both strength and vulnerability, both certainty and doubt. It can engage with the world without losing itself in the world. It can love without becoming dependent on being loved. It can create without needing validation for what it creates. It can exist in solitude without loneliness, because it has found the companionship of its own depths. If you are in the fire, Right now, if you are experiencing the death of your old self, you are exactly where you need to be. Not because it feels good, not because it is easy, but because this is the only way through to who you actually are. Every moment of confusion is your psyche reorganizing itself around truth instead of illusion. Every moment of emptiness is space being created for something more authentic to emerge. Every moment of fear is the old self recognizing it cannot control this process. And that lack of control is not the problem. That lack of control is the point. You cannot think your way into your true self. You cannot plan it or force it or manufacture it. You can only surrender to the process and trust that what wants to emerge through you is wiser than the ego that is afraid of dying. Jung spent his entire career studying this process because he lived it himself. His documented confrontation with the unconscious nearly destroyed him, but it also became the foundation for everything he contributed to psychology. He learned to trust the images that arose from his depths. He learned to dialogue with the figures that appeared in his visions. He learned to see his psychological crisis not as breakdown, but as breakthrough. And from that experience, he developed the map that can guide others through the same territory. The old self dies, so the new self can breathe. This is not metaphor. This is the actual mechanism of psychological transformation. And once you understand this, once you see that the confusion and pain and emptiness are not signs that something is wrong, but signs that something is finally going right, everything changes. You stop resisting. You stop trying to fix yourself back into the shape that no longer fits. You allow the process to unfold, and in that allowing, in that surrender, the new self begins to take its first breath. In The Alchemist's Path, perception training for empaths, you'll turn overwhelm into wisdom with practical drills, Jung-inspired boundaries, and step-by-step perception training. This guide includes 3 exclusive chapter videos to deepen each lesson. Written by Surreal Mind, 236 pages, beautifully designed 8.5 by 11 downloadable ebook, in stock now. Start your training today. Feel deeply while thinking clearly. Get The Alchemist's Path at thesurrealmind.com.